What's going on, guys? Can you believe we're back already? This time out, it's the Mexico City Grand Prix, and we're going in with a lot of intrigue, a lot of questions, and hopefully we'll get a lot of answers. I can't believe it's already race week once again. It feels like the end of the season is very rapidly approaching, because it is. It's going to get very exciting down the stretch. The championship fight is well and truly on, and the real question is going to be, is someone going to assert themselves this weekend around the Mexico City circuit? There's going to be a lot of tricky conditions. Mexico always provides some very interesting setups, especially because of the elevation. It'll be very interesting to see which teams get it right, which ones get it wrong. But right now, we're about to make our predictions for just that. Who's going to get it right with our biggest positive surprise? Who's going to get it wrong with our biggest disappointment? Who's going to nail it in qualifying for our qualifying top three? Who, when it's all said and done, is going to get the job done with our race podium? And as always, there's always a peak and a bit of unpredictability. That's why we have our one crazy prediction to wrap us up. Guys, it's the 2025 Mexico City Grand Prix predictions. Let's kick things off with our biggest positive surprise, and for this time out, I'm going with a single driver after going for multiple teams in the last predictions for the US Grand Prix, in which, besides qualifying the podium, I did predict all teams. So we're going a bit different this time around. My biggest positive surprise for the Mexico City Grand Prix is Isaac Hadjar. Isaac coming off of a pretty tough weekend here around the Circuit of the Americas, just down the road from me. Obviously, his qualifying snafu for the Grand Prix put him basically at the back, and that was essentially his Grand Prix done and dusted from there. I think we'll see a bit of a bounce back. I feel like it's been a minute since we've seen a really good Isaac finish, especially since now that we go to Mexico, where he has at least a little bit of experience, having done an FP1 session in years previous. I think we'll see hopefully a bit of a renewed Isaac. I think he'll be wanting to get back to kind of some of, that similar sort of vein that we saw earlier on in the season when the V-Carb was looking pretty good. I think it's definitely still capable of producing very solid results, but I think we finally see Hadjar get back into the points once again and get a solid round for him on the board following a pretty tough US Grand Prix. But we'll see how he does. But congratulations, Isaac. You're my pick for biggest positive surprise. All right, let's go ahead and move on forward with our pick for biggest disappointment. And this one actually pains me to say, because I think I'm going for it. My biggest disappointment for the Mexico City Grand Prix here in 2025 is Oscar Piastri. I know what you're saying. He has been on an absolute horrid run of form. It surely can't last forever. But unfortunately, history is not necessarily on his side. Last season, this is about the time in the season where he really started to struggle down the stretch of the season. Now, whether that was because he was then backing Lando to try and catch Max, or potentially, being out of the championship contention and, basically having the constructors wrapped up at that point, it is unknown to be seen so far. But so far, his recent run of form is suggesting that maybe the pressure is getting to him. Maybe he just doesn't have, the mental fortitude to really challenge and push down the rest of the season. Last year, he really started to struggle about this time, and following a US Grand Prix where he finished P5 and pretty comfortably in P5 without truly ever really challenging forward, I think it's time to start looking at it and going, is the pressure getting to be a bit too much? Is this an opportunity where we see him finish even further down the points, to the point where either his championship lead is down to almost nothing, or potentially even lost? Time will tell. Mexico provides a lot of very interesting conditions. It'll be very, very interesting to see who shows up and who performs. Time will tell, but I'm sorry, Oscar. You're my pick for biggest disappointment this week in Mexico. All right, let's move on now to our qualifying top three Saturday afternoon. Let's see who we have on our top three. Starting in P3, I'm going with Lando Norris in this one. I think this is a situation where we'll potentially see a bit of an issue from the McLaren side. I think it's been very obvious that they necessarily have been moving away from really truly focusing on the 2025 car, especially now that they have the constructors title wrapped up. And so this is a situation where we've seen them slowly start to move backwards in terms of pure qualifying pace, kind of moving away from what we saw earlier in the season, where they really nailed it with the car and were really developing and pushing hard. and really, putting in 1-2s so much that it was basically a who's going to finish or qualify P3 type of situation. But at this point, I think we need to start looking at it and going, qualifying isn't necessarily the McLaren strong suit anymore. It's going to be what it comes down to in race pace, which it's still very good at, but not even potentially the best anymore. This is going to be a situation where it's still very much good enough to qualify in the top 3, but maybe, just maybe, depending on the right situation, maybe not so much in the front row. So Lando Norris, P3 in my qualifying predictions. As we move on now to P2 in my qualifying predictions, this one actually is going to be a bit of a Hail Mary from me. My prediction for P2 in qualifying is Charles Leclerc. This is coming off of purely hopium and copium from just how well Ferrari's managed to turn it around in the US Grand Prix between the sprint race and regular qualifying and then the race itself. This is a situation where it could go one of two ways. It's either going to be they're challenging for a potential win or podium to anywhere from that to finishing P9 and P10 because the car just can't handle the elevation, the overheating, the dirty air, you name it, it could happen either way. This is a situation where I think Charles, whether, it plays much into it or not, carrying a little bit of confidence following a US Grand Prix where he was running in second for a majority of the race before ultimately losing out to the superior car of the McLaren. And so this is a situation which we could potentially see him qualify on the front row or potentially get knocked out in Q2. Who really knows? I'm going with hopium. I'm going with the positive side. Charles Leclerc, my pick for P2 in qualifying around Mexico. As we move on now to pole position, the one, the only pole position here in Mexico City, obviously moving away from sprint races once again. A classic 3 practice sessions straight into qualifying and then a race on Sunday. I'm going with Max Verstappen in qualifying this time. It is truly unbelievable to see the turnaround that he and Red Bull have had so far, coming especially with all the confidence and momentum that he has following a US Grand Prix where he took sprint pole, won the sprint race, took regular qualifying pole and won the race and almost had the fastest lap if it wasn't for Kimi Antonelli. And so this is a situation where Red Bull really truly seems to continue to be tweaking the car here or there to try and get the most out of it, and knowing that Max has a chance mathematically and at this point momentumly to catch Lando and Oscar in the championship. All it takes is a little bit here or there. McLaren very obviously isn't developing the car. Red Bull obviously is getting the best out of Max Verstappen right now, and he has all the momentum in the world. I think this is setting up to a truly momentous march down towards the finale of the 2025 season. It all starts with a Max Verstappen pole position in Mexico, followed by Charles Leclerc in P2 joining him on the front row, and Lando Norris rounding out the top 3 in qualifying. All right, race podium up next. This is where the questions will truly be answered and the drama will truly unfold. Let's go ahead, kick things off with our podium predictions in P3. I'm actually going with George Russell to finish on the podium. I think it's, been a couple of weekends since we've seen him do this, but at the same time, it does feel like one of those situations where the Mercedes could potentially do pretty decently around Mexico. It feels like they've always just been kind of lurking there, and especially on higher downforce setups, I think we've seen them do particularly well. Think back to Singapore where he won the race. Now, obviously the elevation does provide a lot of very interesting factors, but I think this has more to do with the rest of my podium prediction and who potentially falls off, more so maybe than Mercedes truly being on the pace from the jump. But George Russell, don't let me down. P3, I think you would take it every day of the week. As we move on now to P2 in my predictions, we are going with Lando Norris. I think this is going to be very similar of a situation to what we saw around Circuit of the Americas, but obviously Charles is starting ahead of Lando this time. I think this is going to be a situation where potentially Lando might get held up a little bit depending on the race start. Obviously, Mexico has a very unique factor of the very, 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 very long run down towards turn 1. And it's all going to come down to who gets the best slipstream and who, really makes a move stick going to turns 1 and 2. I think it's a situation that even if Lando doesn't make it through on the run down to turn 1, he definitely still has the car that's plenty fast enough to make his way forward and finish P2 on the road, getting himself another podium and even closer to a championship lead, or potentially even a championship lead depending on what his teammate does that Sunday. So it'd be very, very interesting to see what happens. But going on to P1, my winner for the 2025 Mexico City Grand Prix is Max Verstappen. I think this is we're very quickly marching back towards the thing of It's going to be a Max win until someone proves me wrong. And I know that he won Monza. I know he won in the US and got basically the maximum points possible to him. But this is going into another track where I think Red Bull should be pretty good. And I think they're very clearly, really putting themselves in position to potentially be the fastest car on any particular weekend, especially with Max Verstappen behind the wheel. It's going to get interesting. It's going to be fun. What's going to happen following week, who knows? But all I know is my prediction for the podium is a George Russell P3, a Lando Norris P2, and a Max Verstappen win. All right, let's round out this bad boy with our one crazy prediction. This one is something you don't see too often these days, but especially at Mexico, I think it is very likely much more potentially than any other weekend. And my one crazy prediction is that we will see at minimum 3 mechanical DNFs. That is mechanical specific DNFs. And I think that presents itself as a pretty, actually almost very plausible, results. Obviously the elevation of Mexico causing a lot of issues, both with, aerodynamics as well as engine cooling. You'll see some teams take some pretty drastic measures when it comes to engine cooling to try and keep these cars, running the entire race distance. Who knows what happens if you're fighting for the last couple of points? Who knows what happens if you're fighting for a potential podium? Do you push the car hard enough to potentially make it pop? I think at this point, going into the last handful of races of a regulation era, I think this is a situation where we could potentially see some teams running pretty thin in terms of, engine components or internal combustion engine components. So it's just going to get, it could happen, We don't see mechanical DNFs all too often. It's almost more of a shock when it happens than when it doesn't these days. But Mexico provides us a very interesting situation. The end of this regulation era presents us with some teams potentially trying to save a little bit of money to focus on their 2026 car. Could they potentially be stretching an engine out just a little too long? Time will tell. That's all I'm saying. Time will tell. My one crazy prediction, at minimum 3 mechanical DNFs in the race. But there we have it, guys. We are back once again in Mexico City for some more Formula One action. I'm really excited to see our questions answered once again. Is Oscar gonna bounce back? Is he going to have a bit of a resurgence and kind of reestablish himself at the top of the championship order? Is Max Verstappen going to continue to dominate and continue to pile on race wins? Is Lando going to be kind of there, just continually getting himself good points to continue to march towards at least the provisional lead in the championship? Time will tell. We are very quickly approaching just a handful of races left. I cannot wait to see what happens. I hope you can't either. We'll be back once the weekend is over with to talk about everything that happened and go over these predictions we just made. But guys, I hope you enjoy the weekend, and I'll see you guys in the next one.